June 18th, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The water reached us before the guards did. Not the taste of it, just the sound. A hollow metallic rush, sudden and continuous, echoing faintly along the wooden walls of the barracks. It was unlike any water I'd heard in years. Too steady, too confident, as if it knew it would not be taken away. Someone near me inhaled sharply. Another woman shifted her weight. No one spoke. I stood at the end of the line, watching an American soldier turn a handle on a pipe fixed to the wall. The pipe was dull silver, thick, solid, bolted in place like it belonged there. Water poured from it freely, striking the bottom of a metal basin before spilling into a glass. A glass. That alone felt wrong. In Europe, glass had disappeared long before the war ended. Windows shattered and were never replaced. Bottles were reused until they cracked. Cups were tin, enamel, sometimes wood. Glass was fragile, unnecessary. Something you stopped trusting once bombs learned how to find kitchens. This glass was clear, perfect, no chips, no cloudiness. When the soldier set it on the table, light passed through it cleanly, bending the edges of the world inside. He slid it toward me. I did not reach for it. The smell came next. Soap. Not sharp, not medicinal. Something faintly sweet, like it had once been flowers. It clung to his hands, to the air round the basin, to the towel hanging beside the pipe. It did not smell like scarcity. It smelled like routine. The glass waited. I stared at the water inside. It did not move. No particles floated in it. No film shimmered on the surface. It did not smell of iron or earth or boiled rags. It did not remind me of rivers crossed under fire or buckets drawn from craters. It reminded me of nothing at all. That frightened me more than anything. In wartime, nothing this clean was meant for people like me. The soldier did not look at me. He had already turned back to the pipe, filling another glass for the woman behind me. His uniform was loose at the collar. Sweat darkened the fabric beneath his arms. He worked without urgency, without ceremony, as though this were an ordinary task he had performed 1,000 times before. Around us, the camp breathed. Wood creaked. Somewhere beyond the fence, an engine coughed to life. Cicadas buzzed in the Texas heat, loud and unconcerned. I could feel the weight of the glass waiting for my hand. I had been thirsty before. Truly thirsty. Thirst in France during the retreat, when we chewed on buttons just to keep our mouths wet. Thirst in Italy, when the wells were fouled and the rivers ran brown with things we did not name. Thirst that burned the back of the throat and made swallowing painful. Thirst that taught you how to measure water in sips, how to hide your desperation from others who needed it just as badly. This was different. This was abundance, disguised as kindness. The woman ahead of me lifted her glass and drank. I watched her closely. Her shoulders did not tense. She did not cough. She did not wait. She swallowed as though the act itself were familiar, unremarkable. When she lowered the glass, her lips glistened. She blinked once, quickly, and stepped aside. Nothing happened to her. No laughter, no blow, no sudden order shouted in a language I barely understood. Still, I did not move. I had been taught to fear moments like this, not the obvious cruelty that was easy to understand. It was the quiet gestures that were dangerous, the ones that asked you to trust, the ones that made you question what you had been told. Water could be poisoned. That was the simplest explanation. Or it could be a test. Drink too eagerly and reveal weakness. Drink too slowly and reveal defiance. Either way, they would learn something about you. I remembered a lecture given years earlier, before the war began to devour everything. The officer had spoken calmly, methodically about the enemy. He had told us the Americans were clever, that they hid cruelty behind comfort, that they fed prisoners well so they could extract obedience later. That mercy was just another weapon. Standing there, I wanted to believe him. The glass caught the light again as the sun shifted, throwing a pale reflection across the table. I saw my own face in it, distorted, thinner than I remembered. My hair was pulled back too tightly, strands escaping at my temples. My eyes looked older than they should have. The soldier glanced up then, briefly. His eyes passed over me without judgment, without curiosity. He did not say my name. He did not say anything at all. He simply nudged the glass closer just enough to make it clear it was meant for me. Then he turned away. That, too, felt wrong. I expected him to watch, to wait, to see what I would do. Instead, he reached for another glass, rinsed it quickly under the running pipe, and filled it again. The water did not slow. It did not hesitate. It did not need to be conserved. Behind me, someone whispered my name. My fingers curled around the edge of the table. I leaned closer to the glass and lowered my face until my nose was just above the rim. I breathed in carefully. Nothing. No smell. No warning. Just cool air rising from the surface. I thought of the places water had failed us, of canteens drained and never refilled, of muddy cups passed hand to hand, of promises made by men who no longer believed them. I straightened and looked around. The guards were scattered along the fence line, rifles slung low, their posture relaxed. No one was watching me. No one seemed to care whether I drank or not. That was the final shock. In a world where everything was measured, rationed, controlled, here was something offered freely, and then forgotten. I lifted the glass. It was heavier than I expected, solid in my hand. The water inside trembled slightly as I raised it, catching the light one last time. For a moment, I simply held it there, level with my eyes, as if studying an artifact from another life. The glass was clear. Too clear to be real, and I did not know what frightened me more, that it might harm me, or that it might not. I did not drink. The glass hovered in my hand, close enough that I could feel the coolness rising from it, but my mouth remained closed. The water inside trembled once, then settled again, as patient as the country that had produced it. Fear came rushing in to fill the silence. Not sudden fear. This one was old. It had been planted carefully, watered over years, until it grew roots deep enough to survive even this moment. We were taught that mercy was a trick, that the enemy who smiled was more dangerous than the one who shouted, that anything given freely would be taken back with interest. I lowered the glass slightly, and my mind carried me far from Texas, back to Europe where water had weight. In the final years of the war, water was never just water. It was something you searched for, argued over, hid. Rivers ran where armies had passed, but we did not drink from them without boiling first, and even then we watched each other closely. Wells were shelled or poisoned or simply dry. Buckets stood empty beside houses that no longer had roofs. I remembered a field hospital outside Florence, set up in what had once been a school. The chalkboards were still on the walls, arithmetic half finished, as if lessons had simply paused and never resumed. We carried the wounded in on doors pulled from their hinges. There was never enough water. Not for drinking, not for cleaning, not for washing blood from hands that shook too badly to hold bandages steady. The doctors told us to save it for the worst cases. We did. We always did. The rest of us learned to live with dry mouths and cracked lips. We learned how to swallow without saliva. Outside the hospital, children waited. Thin, barefoot, silent. They held out cups, tin, chipped, sometimes nothing more than folded paper, and asked for water with eyes that no longer expected answers. Sometimes we had none to give. Sometimes we gave them what we should have saved for ourselves. Either way, the look on their faces stayed with me. That was what war had done to water. It had turned it into a form of power. By 1944, back home in Germany, rationing had tightened until it cut into bone. Food cards grew smaller. Bread grew darker, heavier. Meat became a rumor. Even water was watched, especially in the cities. Pipes damaged by bombing delivered less each week. We filled bathtubs when we could, not to bathe, but to store what might be needed later. The radio never spoke of this. It spoke instead of sacrifice, of discipline, of endurance. It told us the enemy lived in excess and rot, that Americans were careless with resources because they did not understand their value. It told us that if captured, we would be humiliated, weakened, stripped of dignity. It told us they poisoned wells. Standing in Camp Hearn, holding a glass of water so clear it felt unreal, all of those lessons rose up at once. I watched the others. A young woman, 2 places down, lifted her glass and drank in 3 quick swallows as if afraid it would disappear if she hesitated. Her shoulders sagged afterward, relief or exhaustion. I could not tell. Another woman held her glass with both hands, staring into it without moving, her knuckles white. One of the older prisoners took a single sip and then stopped, as though waiting for pain. Nothing happened. The guards did not react. The soldiers continued their work, turning the handle, rinsing glasses, filling them again. The sound of water never faltered. It was not measured out. No one barked orders. No one kept count. That was what unsettled me most. If water meant power, then whoever controlled it controlled life. That was something we understood well, and yet here the Americans did not guard it. They did not ration it. They did not even seem aware that it might be valuable, or perhaps they were so powerful they did not need to be. The thought made my stomach tighten. If I drank, I would have to accept what my senses were telling me. That this water was real, that this abundance was not a performance, that the enemy we had been taught to fear lived in a different world entirely. And if that were true, then everything I believed about the war, about strength and weakness, about who was winning and why, would begin to unravel. I thought of the journey that had brought me here, of the long Atlantic crossing, the endless trains moving west through a country that seemed to have no edges, fields that went on forever, towns lit at night, factories humming even after dark. I had seen water then, too, rivers wide and calm, reservoirs full, irrigation canals cutting clean lines through farmland that still produced food while Europe starved. At the time, I told myself it was illusion, that it could not last, that no nation could sustain such excess in wartime. But now the excess was in my hand. The glass felt heavier, or perhaps my arm was tiring. A drop of condensation slid down the side and touched my skin. Instinctively, I flinched. I imagined the headlines we had been shown, the posters, the warnings whispered in barracks and classrooms. They pretend to be kind. They soften you. Then they break you. I imagined being laughed at for my trust, punished for my weakness. Yet nothing in this room matched those images. The soldiers were young, ordinary. One of them hummed under his breath, a tune I did not recognize. Another wiped his hands on a towel and reached for a cigarette, offering one to a fellow guard before lighting his own. They looked tired, not cruel, focused, not theatrical. I realized then that fear was the last thing still tying me to the world I had known. If I let it go, if I drank, I would be stepping into something unknown, something my training had not prepared me for. I would be admitting that the story we had been told was incomplete at best, a lie at worst. My hand shook. The water rippled. I lowered the glass to the table and let it rest there, untouched. Around me, the line began to move. Some women stepped away, glasses empty. Some left theirs half full. No one was forced. No one was stopped. The soldier at the pipe turned the handle again. The sound of water filled the space between us, steady and unafraid. I stared at the glass and understood my fear for what it was. It was not fear of poison. It was fear of collapse. Because if I drank, and nothing happened, then I would have to face the possibility that mercy was not a trick at all, that it was simply how they lived, and that was a truth I did not yet know how to survive. I expected the moment to end with an order, a shout, a command, a sharp word in English that I would not understand but would obey anyway. That was how fear usually resolved itself into something loud and undeniable. Instead, nothing happened. The glass sat on the table between my hands, untouched. The soldier did not return to claim it. He did not clear it away. He did not remind me it was there. The line moved forward, bodies shifting, boots scraping softly against the wooden floor, and still the water waited. That was when I understood something was different. He had given me the choice. The soldier stepped aside to make room for another woman. As he did, he reached for the towel hanging beside the pipe and wiped his hands slowly, methodically, as if he were finishing a task already complete. Then he turned his back to me. Completely. Not halfway. Not over his shoulder. Fully turned, facing the wall where the pipe disappeared into the boards. I felt my breath catch. He did not tell me to drink. He did not watch to see if I would. In the war, I had known. No one ever turned their back on power. You guarded it. You rationed it. You measured it carefully and punished anyone who took more than their share. Turning away meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was something we had been trained to despise. Behind me, someone spoke softly. A young woman, no older than 20, her accent still thick with home, held out her empty glass toward the soldier's back. "More," she said, the word awkward but clear. He did not turn around. He simply reached back, took the glass from her hand without looking, rinsed it under the running water, and filled it again. The stream did not slow. The basin overflowed and spilled onto the floor, darkening the wood before draining away. He handed the glass back to her, full to the rim. She took it with both hands, eyes wide as though she had asked for something forbidden and been granted a miracle instead. No one corrected her. No one scolded him. The water kept flowing. That was the moment my fear began to change shape. I had expected kindness to announce itself, to arrive with explanation or justification, or at least attention. I had been taught that mercy was always strategic, always conditional. This was neither. This was quiet. This was routine. The pipe did not belong to the soldier. It belonged to the building, to the camp, to the system that had put it there. A system that assumed water would be needed, that it would be used, that no one would need permission to drink. I lifted the glass again. The water inside was still cool, still clear, still waiting. Around me, the room settled into a rhythm. Glasses filled, glasses emptied. Women stepped aside, some with relief etched into their faces, others still cautious, still uncertain. The guards spoke among themselves in low voices, complaining about the heat, about a shipment that had arrived late, about a letter one of them had received that morning. Ordinary things. That was another shock. That this moment, so heavy with meaning for us, was simply part of their day. I thought of the America I had glimpsed through train windows on the journey here. Fields planted in careful rows. Small plots behind houses where vegetables grew thick and green. Gardens everywhere, even in towns that seemed busy enough without them. Someone had explained to us during transport that Americans called them victory gardens, that civilians grew their own food so more could be sent to the front. At the time, I had dismissed it as propaganda of a different kind. But now, I saw the same logic here. Abundance was not something they flaunted. It was something they organized. The pipe in front of me was not impressive on its own. It was not decorated or polished. It was functional, solid, built to last. Somewhere far away, water was being drawn, treated, carried through miles of infrastructure so that it could arrive here, at this moment, without ceremony. No one celebrated it. No one guarded it. I realized then that abundance, to them, was not a performance. It was a promise kept quietly, again and again, by systems that worked even when no one was watching. The soldier finished wiping his hands and stepped away from the pipe. Another took his place without comment. The exchange was seamless, practiced. They had done this before. They would do it again. Still, no one looked at me. The choice remained. I brought the glass closer, my fingers leaving faint marks on the surface where condensation had gathered. My reflection wavered in the water, pale and uncertain. I thought of home, not the slogans or the speeches, but the kitchen of my childhood before the war, before ration cards, before fear had entered every decision. I remembered water then, too. Cold from the pump, poured without counting. I had not thought of that in years. The woman who had asked for more water drank now, slowly, deliberately. She closed her eyes for a moment as she swallowed, then opened them again, as if testing whether the room had changed. It had not. The guards were still guards. The fences were still there. We were still prisoners. And yet something fundamental had shifted. I took a small step back from the table, still holding the glass. No one stopped me. No one followed. I leaned against the wall, letting the cool wood press against my shoulder and watch the scene unfold. Water was still running. I understood then that kindness did not always arrive as an act. Sometimes it arrived as a structure, as pipes laid decades earlier, as standards enforced long before the war began, as an assumption that even an enemy would need to drink. This was not charity. It was not pity. It was order. The kind of order that did not require cruelty to sustain itself. I had been raised to believe that strength came from control, from discipline enforced through fear. Here was a different kind of strength, one that trusted its own foundations enough to turn away. My grip on the glass loosened. The fear that had held me in place began to ebb, replaced by something unfamiliar and unsettling. Not relief, not gratitude, recognition. If this was how they treated water, if this was how they treated even us, then the war was not only being fought with weapons and numbers. It was being fought with systems that assumed survival was not a privilege, but a baseline. I looked down at the glass again. The water was still too clear to be real, but it had not disappeared. And for the first time since I had arrived in this place, I began to suspect that nothing bad would happen if I trusted what was in front of me. Not because the soldier had told me to, but because he had not needed to. The moment stretched longer than it should have. I stood there with the glass in my hand, aware of how quiet my own breathing sounded compared to the steady rush of water behind me. I had already accepted the idea of drinking. I could feel it forming somewhere beneath thought, beneath fear. And yet my body refused to move at the same pace as my mind. That hesitation, that narrow space between decision and action, was where everything broke. I lifted the glass. The rim touched my lower lip, cool and smooth. Instinctively I paused again, bracing for something I could not name. Pain, perhaps. A sharpness. The taste of metal or chemicals. Some signal that would justify the fear I had been carrying for so long. There was nothing. No smell rose from the surface. No bitterness. No heat. The water did not announce itself the way water had learned to do during the war. It did not warn me. I tilted the glass slightly. The first sip slid into my mouth without resistance. It was neither sweet nor sour. It did not coat my tongue. It did not cling. It simply moved, cool and clean, over places that had grown used to dryness and ache. My throat did not tighten. My stomach did not revolt. Nothing hurt. That was the shock. My body reacted before my thoughts could catch up. A sharp breath escaped my chest, unplanned, almost a gasp. My hand trembled and the water inside the glass sloshed dangerously close to the rim. I tried to steady it, but my fingers would not obey. I swallowed, and then it happened. The sound that came out of me did not feel like my own. It was small, broken, more breath than voice. I pressed my lips together as if that might stop what was coming, but the pressure behind my eyes had already built too far. Tears blurred my vision. I had not cried when I was captured. I had not cried on the ship. I had not cried when I first saw the fences. I had learned, like everyone else, which emotions were inefficient, Which ones wasted energy that might be needed later? But now my eyes burned, and my chest tightened, and my breath began to come in uneven pulls. Water spilled over the edge of the glass and ran down onto my hand, then onto the floor. I felt it drip onto my boot, darkening the worn leather. The sensation startled me enough that I laughed once, sharply, a sound that immediately turned into something else. My shoulders shook. I tried to stop. I truly did. I lowered the glass, set it on the table with more force than necessary, and brought my free hand up to my face. I wiped at my eyes roughly, embarrassed by the wetness there, by the loss of control. The last thing I wanted was to be seen like this, in front of them, in front of the enemy. But my body did not care about that distinction anymore. It had already decided something important, something my mind had resisted for too long. The tears kept coming. I bowed my head, staring at the floorboards, counting the cracks between them, willing myself to regain composure. My breathing sounded too loud in my own ears. I was aware, distantly, of movement around me, boots shifting, someone stepping closer, then stopping. A voice reached me, gentle, uncertain. "Why are you crying?" The words were simple. The tone was not accusing. It was not mocking. It held no command in it at all, just confusion, perhaps even concern. I could not answer. I knew the words, of course. I understood the question. But there was no sentence that could carry the truth of what was happening inside me. No explanation that would not sound absurd or weak. Because I was not crying because of the water. I was crying because my body had remembered something my mind had been trying to forget. It remembered what it felt like not to measure every swallow, not to plan thirst hours in advance, not to bargain with yourself about whether today's ache was worth alleviating or whether you should save the strength for tomorrow. It remembered that for years, quietly, gradually, I had accepted deprivation as normal, that I had told myself this was simply how life was now, that wanting more was childish, dangerous. The water had undone that lie in seconds. I pressed my sleeve to my mouth, trying to contain the sound, trying to fold myself back into something smaller, more manageable. The shame came quickly, sharp and familiar. Shame for crying. Shame for needing. Shame for revealing something I had been trained to conceal at all costs. I did not want them to see me like this. I did not want to give them this. But when I lifted my head again, blinking through tears, I saw that the soldier was not staring at me. He stood a few steps away, his body angled slightly aside, as if giving me space even now. His hands hung loosely at his sides. His expression was not hard. It was not triumphant. He looked uncomfortable. Not because of me, I realized, but because he did not know what to do. That, too, was unexpected. Another woman approached quietly and placed a hand on my arm. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her touch was tentative, respectful. I nodded once, grateful and mortified all at once. The glass of water still sat on the table where I had left it, a thin ring of moisture spreading beneath it. It had not been taken away. No one had decided I was unworthy of finishing it. I reached for it again, my hand shaking less this time, though still unsteady. I raised it carefully, afraid of spilling more, afraid of drawing attention back to myself. The rim touched my lips again. I drank. This time, I did not sip. I let the water flow, cool and effortless down my throat. I felt it move through me, easing something tight and old inside my chest. When I swallowed, it did not burn. When I breathed, it did not catch. The tears slowed, then stopped. I lowered the glass, now nearly empty, and held it there, my fingers leaving new marks where the condensation had formed again. My face felt hot, swollen from crying. I knew my eyes were red. I could feel the residue of embarrassment clinging to me like a second skin. Still, no one laughed. No one commented. The soldier who had spoken earlier nodded once, almost to himself, as if acknowledging something he did not fully understand but accepted anyway. Then he stepped back, returning to his place near the pipe, where water continued to run for those who needed it. The line resumed its quiet movement. Life, it seemed, went on. I leaned against the wall again, my legs suddenly weak, the aftershock of emotion leaving me hollow and strangely light at the same time. I pressed the back of my hand to my eyes one last time, then lowered it and took a steadying breath. The shame lingered, but it was changing, thinning around the edges. I realized then that what had undone me was not kindness alone. It was the absence of explanation. No one had told me I deserved water. No one had made a speech about humanity or rules or conventions. No one had demanded gratitude. They had simply allowed it. And in that allowance, in that quiet assumption that even a prisoner, even an enemy, would need something as basic as water, I felt something shift permanently. I had been prepared for cruelty. I had been prepared for propaganda, even of a different sort. I had not been prepared for decency so ordinary that it required no justification. Standing there, with a half-empty glass and tear-streaked cheeks, I understood why my body had reacted the way it did. It was not relief. It was grief. Grief for all the years I had lived as though suffering were the natural state of things. Grief for how easily I had accepted less and called it strength. The water had not asked me to change my beliefs. It had simply exposed them, and once exposed, they could no longer hold. That night, sleep would not come. The barracks settled into its usual sounds. Coughs, the rustle of blankets, the low murmur of whispered conversations that faded as exhaustion took hold. Outside, insects droned steadily, in different defenses and uniforms. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded, long and low, and then was gone. I lay on my cot, staring at the underside of the bunk above me, the wood darkened by years of use. My hands still smelled faintly of soap. I kept lifting them to my face as if the scent might vanish if I did not notice it. Water had followed me into the night. Not the glass itself, but the idea of it, the sound of it, the ease with which it had been given and forgotten. It replayed in my mind with a clarity that refused to dull. I tried to push the memory aside, to tell myself it was only fatigue, that emotion had made the moment larger than it deserved to be. But the truth pressed closer the longer I lay there. If the enemy could give water, clean water, without asking anything in return, then something fundamental about this war was not what I had been taught. I thought of home, of rules layered over rules, each one justified by necessity, by survival, by the promise that sacrifice now would lead to security later. Food cards stamped and re-stamped, queues that stretched for blocks, radios that spoke endlessly of enemies who hoarded and wasted where we learned discipline and restraint. Control had been explained to us as virtue, distribution as fairness, propaganda as protection. We had been told that suffering was proof of righteousness, that deprivation was a sign of moral strength, that those who lived comfortably must have done so at the expense of others. And yet, here I was, lying in an American prison camp, my stomach full, my throat no longer aching, my hands clean, my body resting on a mattress that did not collapse beneath me. The contradiction was unbearable. The Americans did not need to explain themselves. They did not justify the water with speeches or slogans. They did not demand gratitude or obedience in exchange for it. The water was simply there, because someone, somewhere, had decided long before the war that people should have it. That decision echoed outward through pipes and pumps and treatment plants, through standards and maintenance schedules, through men whose job it was to make sure the system kept working no matter who stood beneath it. I realized then that what I had witnessed was not kindness as an act. It was kindness as infrastructure. In Germany, power had always announced itself. It marched, it spoke loudly, it wrapped itself in symbols and demanded acknowledgement. It controlled access to essentials, food, fuel, information, and used that control to shape loyalty and fear. Here, power was quieter. It did not shout. It poured quietly from a pipe. The sentence formed fully in my mind, complete and unmistakable. I repeated it to myself, slowly, as if testing whether it would hold. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it pours quietly from a pipe. I turned onto my side, pulling the thin blanket closer around my shoulders. The thought did not bring comfort. It brought clarity, and with it a kind of unease deeper than fear. They hadn't defeated me. They had undone me, not by force, not by humiliation, but by showing me a world in which basic dignity did not need to be negotiated, even for an enemy. A world in which systems were built not only to win wars, but to sustain life while fighting them. I thought of the factories I had seen from the train, their windows glowing even at night, of the fields that still produced food while Europe burned, of the gardens behind small houses, tended by people whose sons and husbands were fighting overseas, who still found time to grow something for themselves and others. This abundance was not accidental. It was organized, and because it was organized, it could afford to be generous. I understood then why the Americans could turn their backs while offering water, why they did not guard the pipe or count the glasses. They were not afraid of running out, not because they were reckless, but because they trusted the systems they had built to keep supplying what was needed. That trust was a form of confidence I had never known. In my world, scarcity had been weaponized. Fear of losing what little you had was used to bind you tighter to those who claimed to protect you. Here, abundance loosened fear's grip instead of tightening it. The realization left me strangely hollow. If this was true, if the enemy lived this way not as a trick but as a norm, then the war was not merely a contest of armies. It was a contest of values, of which system could sustain human life without devouring it. And in that contest, I began to see who held the deeper advantage. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine explaining this to the girl I had been before the war. The one who had listened dutifully, who had believed that hardship purified, that obedience ensured safety. She would have rejected the idea outright, called it naive, dangerous. I could not blame her. I had needed to feel the water on my tongue to understand. Sleep came eventually, but it was light and broken. I dreamed of pipes running beneath cities, unseen, carrying water through rubble and under walls. I dreamed of hands turning handles without fear. I dreamed of a silence that followed generosity instead of punishment. When I woke the next morning, the memory was still there, solid and undeniable. The camp looked the same. The fences still stood. The guards still patrolled. The war had not ended overnight, but something inside me had shifted permanently. I moved through the day with a new awareness, watching small things I might have ignored before. A guard holding a door open without thinking. A worker fixing a loose board instead of reporting it and waiting for orders. The way food arrived on time, every time without ceremony. No one spoke of mercy. They did not need to. It was embedded in how the place functioned. That was the most unsettling lesson of all. They had not tried to convince me of anything. They had not argued or persuaded or threatened. They had simply allowed me to see how they lived and trusted that the truth of it would speak for itself. It did. By the end of that day, I knew that whatever happened next, however long the war lasted, wherever I went afterward, I would never again believe that strength required cruelty. I had seen another model, and it had undone everything I thought I knew. Years passed before I understood what that day in Texas would become. At first, it lived in me as a private memory, something fragile, something I did not speak about easily. The war ended. We were sent home to a country that barely resembled the one we had left. Cities lay in pieces. Families were smaller. The old certainties were gone, replaced by the long work of surviving what remained. But the memory of that water did not fade. It waited. 20 years later, I heard America again through voices on a radio. through newsreels shown in rebuilt cinemas, through photographs of highways stretching across landscapes I recognized from the train windows of my captivity. America was no longer just the place where I had been a prisoner. It had become an idea, confident, expanding, certain of its direction. And I wondered if the America I remembered still existed. 30 years passed. I had children by then. They asked me questions I could not answer simply. About the war, about guilt, about enemies and forgiveness. I told them what I could. I told them about hunger, about fear, about how easy it was to accept suffering when everyone around you insisted it was necessary. And once, carefully, I told them about water, about a pipe in Texas, about a glass so clear it frightened me, about a moment when kindness arrived without explanation and left me changed. They listened quietly, the way children do when they sense something important but cannot yet place it. 50 years passed. By then, the world had shifted again. Borders softened. Old enemies traded with one another. I watched America from a distance, as I always had, through newspapers, television screens, and the occasional visit from relatives who had crossed the ocean in the other direction. What I saw unsettled me. The America of 1944, the one I had encountered behind barbed wire, had been loud with industry and quiet with confidence. It did not need to shout about its values. It demonstrated them through systems that worked, through abundance shared without comment, through a belief that order and decency were not weaknesses, but foundations. Now, I saw an America arguing with itself. Factories that once roared now stood silent in photographs. Towns, built around work, struggled to remember their purpose. People spoke of division the way we once spoke of enemies, with certainty, with exhaustion, with fear. I did not pretend to understand it all. No outside to weaponize its strength. It was about confidence that did not require cruelty. It was about a country that, for a time, believed so deeply in its own foundations that it could afford to treat even its enemies as people who would one day remember. I do not know what America will become next, but I know what it has been. And when I hear Americans speak with longing about a past that felt more united, more purposeful, more humane, I want to tell them this. That version of America was real. I met it. It did not shout. It poured quietly from a pipe. And somewhere in memory and in possibility, it is still there, waiting to be turned on again. The letters began arriving decades later. They did not come all at once. There was no announcement, no ceremony. Just envelopes, carefully addressed, some in careful English, others translated by children or grandchildren who wanted the words to be understood exactly as they were meant. They always began the same way. You don't know me, but at first I did not understand why they were writing to me. I had not been a leader. I had not performed any great act of courage. I had not saved lives or changed the course of the war. I had only stood in a line in a wooden building in Texas and cried over a glass of water. But that, it seemed, had been enough. The children of former prisoners wrote to tell me that their fathers had spoken of America in ways that confused their teachers, that when lessons at school described enemies and victors in neat categories, their homes had told a quieter story, one that did not fit easily into textbooks. My father said America fed him better than Germany fed its own soldiers. My grandmother said she learned what dignity meant in a place where she had expected humiliation. My grandfather never spoke about battles, but he always spoke about water. Some enclosed photographs. Young men in worn uniforms standing beside American guards, smiling awkwardly, uncertain of the future, but alive. Others enclosed copies of old diary pages, yellowed and fragile, where cramped handwriting recorded small miracles, a warm meal, a clean bed, a doctor who treated wounds gently. Again and again the same theme appeared. America had not tried to impress them. It had simply functioned. For these families, America was not remembered first as a victor, but as a teacher. A place where their parents or grandparents had learned, often for the first time, that power could exist without humiliation, that authority did not need cruelty to sustain itself. They learned that in defeat, they were still human. I kept those letters carefully. I reread them on anniversaries, on quiet afternoons, on days when the world felt loud and impatient. Each one reminded me that history does not move only through generals and treaties. It moves through moments so ordinary they almost disappear. A glass, a pipe, a soldier who turned away. America, in those letters, appeared not as a myth, but as a memory shaped by behavior. It was a country that believed dignity did not need permission, that even an enemy, even a prisoner, deserved the basics of life without bargaining for them. That lesson traveled farther than anyone at Camp Hearn could have known. It crossed oceans. It crossed generations. It crossed the long silence that followed the war. When my own grandchildren asked me why people still wrote, I told them the truth as simply as I could. Because gifts like that do not rust. Weapons do. Uniforms do. Even victories fade into arguments and fitter ever truly can. But I felt the contrast deeply. The America that had turned its back while offering water had not been naive. It had been sure of itself, sure enough to be generous, sure enough not to confuse cruelty with strength. The America I watched now seemed unsure, unsure of its history, unsure of its people, unsure of what it owed to itself and to others. I wondered when that change had begun. Perhaps it was inevitable. No nation remains frozen in its best moment. The world does not allow it. Success breeds comfort. Comfort breeds forgetfulness. And forgetfulness makes values feel optional instead of essential. Still, I could not help comparing. In 1944, America was at war on two fronts. Millions of its young men were overseas. Families rationed food and fuel. And yet, even then, even under that strain, it built camps that ran on the assumption that enemies were still human beings. That assumption had not been dramatic. It had not been debated endlessly. It had been operationalized. It showed up in pipes and pumps, in schedules and maintenance, in guards who did not need to be told to look away. I wondered if Americans remembered that version of themselves. I wondered if they knew how visible it had been to those of us on the other side of the fence. When I spoke with other former prisoners over the years, the stories were different in detail but identical in shape. Someone remembered a meal that tasted like home. Someone else remembered being allowed to write letters when they expected silence. Another remembered a doctor who treated him carefully even after learning where he had fought. None of us spoke of grand speeches or formal gestures. We spoke of ordinary decency. And when we watched America struggle decades later, arguing about its worth, its failures, its divisions, we felt something complicated. Gratitude, yes, but also concern. Because we had seen what America looked like when it trusted itself. We had seen what it could be when it invested not only in weapons, but in systems that carried dignity quietly, reliably, to anyone who stood beneath them. I sometimes imagined returning to that camp, not as a prisoner, but as an observer, walking past the place where the pipe once stood, listening to the water again, watching to see whether anyone noticed it. I wondered if they would, or if abundance had become so taken for granted that it no longer felt like a moral achievement. The younger generations I spoke to, Americans included, often asked me what I thought their country should do now. I never answered directly. That was not my place. Instead, I told them a story. I told them about a day in June, about a glass of water, about a soldier who did not tell me to drink, and I watched their faces as they listened. Some smiled politely, some looked thoughtful. Some grew quiet in a way I recognized. Those were the ones who understood. Because the story was never really about water. It was about a nation at its strongest moment choosing not footnotes, but the memory of being treated as a person when you expected to be treated as less, that stays sharp. It sharpens gratitude. It reshapes loyalty. It teaches a kind of allegiance that no flag alone can command. I have watched America change, as all nations do. I have watched it doubt itself, argue with itself, forget parts of its own story. And still, in those letters, I see a version of America that cannot be erased. Not because it was perfect, but because it was principled when it mattered. That is what those families thank. Not generosity for its own sake, not kindness as performance, but a quiet confidence that said, "This is who we are, even now." In the end, that is what I hope Americans remember when they listen to stories like mine. That the greatest inheritance of that generation was not only victory, it was example. An example carried in pipes and systems, in habits and assumptions, in the simple belief that dignity should never be rationed. History remembers who won the war, but my family remembers who gave us water and asked for nothing in return.